Borley Rectory, or as some like to call it, England's most haunted house, had a reputation for haunting phenomena at least since the late 19th century. Almost every occupant and observer alike has reported some sort of poltergeist activity, from servants' bells ringing on their own, shadowy figures and whispered words, to appearances of a spectral nun strolling in the garden. Borley is a village located in rural Essex, England, that has a population of around 110 people. The closest town, Sudbury, Suffolk, is approximately 3 kilometers or 1.9 miles southeast of Borley. The rectory was built in 1863 by Borley's first rector, Reverend Henry Bull. It was a two-story red brick building with 23 rooms and 3 staircases on grounds of nearly 4 acres. It was for the most part built of brick and stone, and all its doors were thick and heavy. The floors were of heavy wood in some parts and stone in others. The tall trees that surrounded the house gave it a very darkening and depressing effect. No gas or electricity was available, so they used oil lamps and candles. The only water supply came from a deep well in the small courtyard. Nearby was a cottage that was part of the original stable block, and a variety of smaller buildings. The house was located opposite Borley Church on the Essex side of the border. A local legend tells the story of a monk eloping, centuries before, with a nun from a nearby nunnery, and having been caught, were condemned to death, the monk to be hanged, and the nun to be bricked up in the walls of a building that once stood on the same site. It also tells of the periodic appearance of a phantom coach and horses with a headless driver. However, it is worth mentioning that claims that the rectory occupied the site of a former monastery were never substantiated, while those of a nunnery having once existed in the nearby village of Piers were discredited. Reverend Henry Dawson Ellis Bull, Borley's first rector, is described to have been a tall and heavily built man. His principal hobby seems to have been a pretty typical one for a person of his time: shooting and hunting. The Reverend and his wife Caroline had 14 children in total, who were all born in Borley. One June afternoon, 3 of the Bull sisters were returning from a garden party, and when they were just entering the rectory's garden, were flabbergasted, as they all saw, quite clearly, the figure of a nun walking slowly on the other side of the lawn. Although the apparition had been seen before, it had always been at dusk, not in broad daylight. One of the sisters ran into the house to bring out another, and then all 4 of them witnessed the figure walk slowly across the lawn, and as the nun neared the trees that surrounded the house, she slowly disappeared from sight. Later appearances of the nun were witnessed by a number of people, including the rectory's gardener, a local carpenter, and a reporter. A servant of the Bulls, Mrs. Byford, claimed to have heard footsteps when no other living person was present. It is said that Reverend Bull removed and bricked up a window in the dining room because he allegedly objected to an apparition peering through while they were at meals. The Reverend Henry Bull held the parish for 30 years, from 1862 until 1892, the year of his death. He died in the Blue Room, which is immediately over the library and overlooks that part of the garden known as the Nun's Walk. His wife Caroline died in that same room. Their son, Reverend Henry Foister Bull, or Harry, as he was generally known, to avoid confusion with his father, took over the rectory after his father's death. There was a lot of paranormal activity during the incumbency of the Reverend Harry Bull. In nearly all parts of the house, footsteps were heard, particularly in the bedroom hallways. The figure of a tall man in dark clothes was seen on many occasions. One of the Reverend Harry's sisters was awakened several times by a slap on her face. The rectory stayed empty for 18 months after the passing of Reverend Harry Bull in 1927. A new rector, Reverend Guy Eric Smith, moved in with his wife in 1928. The Smiths had been doing missionary work in India and, therefore, did not have any warning or knowledge of the rector's reputation. The first unusual thing they noticed were the noises in the bedrooms at night. Thuds and knocks were constantly heard, often loud enough to wake them. They tried switching rooms, but to no avail. The noises seemed to either happen in all the rooms at the same time or follow them about. Then, the intermittent bell ringing started. The bells, some 20 of them, were hung high up in the kitchen hallway. They were of the old-fashioned spiral spring type, and so had to be rung by bell pulls in the rooms. Again and again, a bell would ring from one of the rooms, even though the only people in the house were the Reverend and his wife. One afternoon, when Reverend Smith was leaving his bedroom, he passed under the arch that leads into the landing when he heard the soft but urgent whispering of a woman over his head. The whispering continued as he walked across the landing to the opposite side, and as he passed under the archway that leads into the private chapel, it suddenly stopped. During the next few weeks, he heard the same urgent whispering again, but this time some words were distinguishable. "Don't, Carlos." Footsteps, thuds, knocks, and bell ringing were an almost daily occurrence. There was no real peace or rest by day or night. Alarmed and concerned by this, Mr. Smith wrote to a national newspaper asking for the name of a society connected with psychic matters which might be able to help him. The paper not only sent the information, but reporters and photographers as well. The immediate result was a flood of sightseers. The newspaper, the Daily Mirror, contacted Harry Price, the director of the National Laboratory of Psychical Research. Price reported that poltergeist-type phenomena occurred. A glass roof was broken, a red glass candlestick was smashed, pebbles were thrown. He said spirit raps were communicated from a seance held in the Blue Room via the wooden frame of a mirror. After Mr. Price's visit, to escape the unwanted attention, the Smiths went to nearby Long Melford and maintained parish duties from there, though not long after, Reverend Smith resigned from the post. Mr. Price, however, continued to have access to the rectory and conducted further investigations there with Lord Charles Hope, a member of the Society for Psychical Research, and journalist Charles Sutton, a reporter from the Daily Mail. In 1930, Reverend Lionel Foister, a first cousin of the Bulls, moved into the rectory with his wife Mary Ann and their adopted daughter Adelaide. Reverend Lionel kept a diary for about 15 months, where he recorded some of the events that took place during their time there. There are only 2 copies of this record, one in the safekeeping of the University of London Council for Psychical Research, and those he sent to Mr. Glanville. Sidney Glanville was one of Price's quote-unquote official observers. The seemingly paranormal activity at the rectory started immediately, and it appeared to mainly center around Mrs. Foister. In one of the first weeks, when she was going upstairs on her way to their bedroom, she heard footsteps following her, and as she turned around, saw the apparition of a man. She continued up the stairs, and when she reached the landing, she turned to look at it again, but it had disappeared. Mary Ann claimed she saw this apparition of a man several times on different occasions. He was wearing a dressing gown, and it had a sort of small case or wallet. Later on, she was shown a picture of the late Harry Ball, and she pointed at him as the apparition she had seen. She is the only one to have seen this figure, and it was always in the same spot. The next inexplicable thing to happen was less alarming, but nonetheless strange. Mary Ann had gone to the bathroom to wash her hands, and so she took off her wristwatch, which was set in a gold bracelet, and put it on a shelf. When she finished drying her hands and turned to put the wristwatch back on, she only found the watch. The gold bracelet was nowhere to be found. This bracelet was not the only thing that disappeared in a strange way, but it was the only object of any value that was lost. On the other hand, things had an odd habit of appearing out of nowhere. A small silk bag containing lavender was found one day on the mantelpiece in the sewing room. It would disappear for a few days and reappear in one of the other rooms. On one occasion, Mr. Foister found it in one of his coat pockets. After several months, it simply disappeared for good. Books also appear spontaneously. The first one was found on the bathroom windowsill. Mr. Foister took little notice of this, thinking that his wife had put it there. She in turn thought that he had put it there. A plain gold ring, presumably a wedding ring, was found on the landing outside the Blue Room. There was no signs of hardware, and the hallmark showed it to have been made in Birmingham in 1863, the year the rectory was finished. No owner for any of these objects was ever found. One night when Mr. Foister was in the bathroom, he heard his wife cry out and run down the hallway. He rushed out to meet her, and she told him that she was coming out of their bedroom when something slapped her across the face. Even though she had a candle with her, she didn't see anyone or anything. The blow had made a cut under her left eye, and blood was running down her face. They didn't find anything that could have caused such a wound. As a result, for the next several years, Sir George Whitehouse and his wife, who lived a few miles away at Arthur Hall in Sudbury, and who had themselves witnessed many incidents at the rectory, had them stay over when things got too bad. Finally, we arrive at perhaps the most contentious phenomena reported by the Foysters: writings on the walls. Some of them just look like meaningless scrolls, but most of them take the form of the letter M and may be an attempt at the beginning of the name Marianne, the person to whom the messages are addressed to. The first writing appeared on the wall of the hallway between the kitchen and the sewing room. It read, "Marianne, get help," and then some words that are incomprehensible. Under this, Marianne herself wrote, "I cannot understand, tell me more." A few days passed, and then the words lights, mass, and prayers appeared. On the opposite side of the kitchen hallway wall, another clear request appeared. It read, "Marianne, please help get." The longest piece of continuous writing was on the side of the arch that leads into the private chapel. It read, "Get lights and prayers here," ending with a few incomprehensible words. Practically all of it has the appearance of being done with difficulty and with great urgency, as though in fear of interruption. It would appear that sometimes the interruption actually occurred. All the messages start with clarity and firmness, but after a word or two seem to weaken, as though energy was dwindling. One peculiar thing about these writings and markings is the height at which they were written. They vary from 4 feet 3 inches to 4 feet 8 inches above floor level. No adult would normally write at this height. Some of the writing was flaked off and analyzed, and it was concluded that it was done with a graphite pencil. According to Mr. Glanville, the photographs and tracings of the writings have been examined by doctors, physiologists, physicists, graphologists, and church dignitaries, but none has been able to offer an acceptable explanation. Unfortunately, Reverend Foyster's health declined. The circumstances did not allow him the peace and quiet necessary for a clergyman to carry out his duties properly, and so he reluctantly resigned his post in 1935. Sadly, he died not long afterward. Harry Price was inclined to believe the Foysters, since some of the phenomena could not have been produced by them fraudulently, and there were many eyewitness accounts. However, he cast doubt on Marianne's role during one of the disturbances, suggesting that she might be responsible for some of the phenomena they witnessed. When the Foysters left Borley in 1935, the rectory stood empty for 2 years. The owners couldn't sell it, nor could they find a tenant, unsurprisingly. The ecclesiastical authorities decided that the rectory should be permanently closed. The parishes of Borley and Liston, a small adjoining village, were combined, and the Reverend A.C. Henning carried out the duties of both from his rectory in Liston. Price, then honorary secretary of the University of London Council for Psychical Investigation, rented the house and grounds for 12 months to further investigate the place and determine whether the phenomena were still active, and if possible, to trace the cause. Price did not visit the rectory during his tenancy because he wanted to form his own conclusions from independent evidence. He entrusted Mr. Sidney Glanville with the task of completing a full report, which he used to write his book The Most Haunted House in England, published in 1940. Mr. Glanville, along with some of the other observers, held seances in different rooms of the rectory. On one such occasion, the alleged entities warned them that the rectory would be badly burned, and under the ruins would be found the bones of a murdered person. This message was received on March 27, 1938. Exactly 11 months later, on February 27, 1939, the house caught fire and was practically destroyed. In 1943, the year before it was demolished, there was another visit made to what was now the remains of the rectory, with the purpose of digging up the cellars. The brick well was emptied of its contents of stone, brick, and accumulated trash. They found a silver jug that was analyzed by experts and found to be manufactured in 1863, the year the rectory was built. Next, they dug up the passage at the foot of the cellar steps. First, they found a jawbone. 5 minutes later, part of a human skull. According to Mr. Glanville, these were immediately submitted to an eminent pathologist who described them respectively as the left mandible with 5 teeth and left parietal and temporal bone, both belonging to a woman probably about 30 years of age. Even though it was controversial, Reverend Henning and Mr. Price interred these remains at Liston. It was controversial because some sources claimed the bones were those of a pig and not a human. Of course, after this discovery, some people just took it as proof that the remains belonged to the ghostly nun. Reverend W. J. Fithian Adams did a paper, which is featured in Price's second book, The End of Borley Rectory, where he theorized that the woman was a former Roman Catholic nun who came from France and married into the Waldegrave family of Borley, and was killed by her husband and buried beneath the cellar floor of a building that had once occupied the site of the rectory. The Reverend, heavily relying on the seances Mr. Glanville and the other observers held, which are also detailed in the book, tried to link the responses they were getting from the entity to the different paranormal accounts the rectory had over its 77 years of existence. He concluded that a French woman known as Mary Lair may have been the victim. Price faced a lot of scrutiny from the public and his peers. After he died in 1948, there was an investigation launched into his findings and reports, and the outcome of it was not at all favorable to his reputation and credibility. The report concluded that he, when things were too slow for his liking, deliberately produced phenomena at times, among other things, to gain fame and publicity for his books. But the fact remains that there isn't sufficient evidence to conclusively determine whether or not this was a true haunting or just a hoax. What do you think? Is it merely a ghost story, or was Borley Rectory truly the most haunted house in England?